Okay, hello again. Welcome if you're tuning in now. And if you're in the room, please do take your seats. We're starting again. Thanks for joining us again at Politico Sustainable Future Week. I'm Zia Weise. I'm an EU climate reporter at Politico. And I am delighted to be joined today by Tina Stege, who is the climate envoy of the Marshall Islands. Tina, thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you, Zia. Thank you for having me.
So we've seen our fair share of extreme weather in the EU this year, but there are many, many countries that are much more vulnerable. And countries like the Marshall Islands are on the front lines of climate change, really. And Tina, I'm wondering if you can give us a bit of a picture of what that means, what that looks like, what kind of impacts you're seeing or you're expecting to see in the coming years.
Well, thank you. And first, just let me say, as we say in the Marshall Islands, Yahweh, hello, to all those there in the room, those tuning in online. It is really a pleasure and an honor to be asked to join you today. As you have said, for many people around the world and many there in Europe, the urgency of the crisis is hitting home now. Floods are destroying homes and businesses, heat waves are sending people to emergency rooms, and fires are forcing communities to flee to safety. For my people, for my aunts, my uncles, cousins, my parents, my younger brother living in the Marshall Islands, this crisis has been on our doorstep for decades. We're an atoll nation, which means we sit just 2 meters above sea level, with no higher ground to retreat to and almost no area that is not coastline. And if you fly to the Marshall Islands, as the plane goes to the runway, you might think that you would be landing in ocean. That's essentially what you see when you look down is an airstrip, and then on both sides immediately is blue. So we're a country that is essentially all coastline. We have climate-related disasters like drought and dengue fever and storm surges that really punctuate the slow onset. What I say that in quotation marks because it certainly doesn't feel slow for those of us living there. But what we call slow onset sea level rise, which is really a clear and present danger to our lives and livelihoods in the Marshalls. We have king tides each month. Even without a storm, you'll have a king tide that is inches closer and closer to homes. We've seen entire islets disappear. And as that sea rises, just to give you an example of a very daily occurrence, is we have wells that have now turned brackish. When I was a little girl, well water was used for cleaning and cooking. Today, the water in the well at my childhood home is only good for flushing toilets. I mean, that's very much just a lived reality of where we are today. In the years ahead, we know that tuna, which our economy relies heavily upon, is likely to migrate away as weather patterns change. So the impacts of climate change cross society and will require us to respond accordingly.
Yeah. Can you perhaps talk a bit about that response? Like, what are you doing to prepare? What can you do to prepare? And where do the limits lie, perhaps?
Well, for us, we know that adaptation, which is we are committed to, and we've been working so hard over the past 3 years in particular as we put together our national adaptation plan. We now have that national adaptation plan. We've just finished. It's been a very busy few months because we want to take that plan to COP28 and launch it there. And we know, looking at that plan, that we will be required to make extremely difficult decisions about what we can protect and preserve, and how to do that. And we also know that in adapting, basically transformative adaptation, there will be loss. It is baked into our adaptation that places will be lost, heritage will be compromised, and that's just the reality that we're living with. This National Adaptation Plan does set out pathways for how we propose to adapt and deal with those changes and with that loss. This includes putting in place nature-based adaptation on some atolls and in the near term. In the longer term, consolidating services on other atolls that can be protected as sea levels rise, alongside investments in hard and soft protective infrastructure. It includes the creation of alternative raised and protected land in new centers, and ultimately planned relocation and consolidating the population into protected areas. We refuse to be forced out of our homelands. We know what exile feels like. We have communities today that are still displaced as a result of the impacts of US nuclear testing on our island. So we know viscerally and firsthand what it means when you're forced to leave your home to go somewhere else. And that is why our NAP is guided by the principles of self-determination and the right to remain. Now, all of that, however, is in a context where the costs we are facing to adapt are extremely high. We're looking in the tens of billions of dollars, and that is without protecting actually the entire nation's territory. That is, making strategic decisions about what can be protected, what needs to be protected to ensure a future for our people. So, already we know that we can't save it all, and we need to find ways to finance that adaptation, and we need the time to do it. And I'll have to be honest, the landscape is very difficult. In terms of time, we depend on others who have the most impact in terms of their emissions to make real cuts, to make cuts that can ensure a 1.5 future for the world, and particularly for places like the Marshall Islands, for whom a future beyond 1.5 is really quite unimaginable. We know what it's like living now with 1.1, and it's already quite so difficult. So we both know that we're not doing well in terms of the time, but we also know that in terms of the finance, there really is just not the support there that we will need. And this is not something that we can do on our own. It certainly it's a problem we're facing that's not of our own making, and we really do depend on partners to help us get through to the other side.
Yeah. Sorry, if I may. Just as you say, this is not a disaster of your own making. The vast majority of emissions in the atmosphere that are driving sea level rise and all these other threats are from richer countries, like countries in the European Union, like the United States. So I'm wondering, looking at finance in particular, but also, as you've said, reducing their own emissions, what do you think these countries' responsibilities are toward your country and the other countries that are so vulnerable to climate change?
Well, I think those responsibilities and that agreement that we all made is really enshrined in the Paris Agreement. In 2015, the global community came together to say that we have a global crisis. It requires a global response. And, there are many sides to that coin, but essentially within Paris, we have, a commitment to make a change in terms of the mitigation and, the emissions reductions that need to be made. A commitment to identify, the needs under adaptation and to put in place those measures that will protect people and their lives and livelihoods. And also a commitment to provide financing to fuel the transition away in our energy systems and in that resilience and protection. So, you know, those commitments and those promises of Paris are what we now in this moment, you know, in 2023, 5 years down, we have what is called the global stock take. It's our chance to hold ourselves accountable to those promises that were made. And we're looking certainly to those, and we work really closely with members of the European Union, and we work closely with those in the Commission through as partners in our High Ambition Coalition to really show and demonstrate what needs to be done. And the thing is that the science makes it very clear at this point what needs to be done, and particularly, you know, who can do it and first. And I mean, we need collective action, but there are those who have more resources and ability to do it. And so particularly on the mitigation side, you know, we know that we have to address the root of the problem, which is the production of fossil fuels. That needs to be phased out. We also know that we need a huge scale up in renewable energy technology. And Europe has been at the forefront of a call for a tripling of renewables. And we think that that is, there's a lot of momentum with that. It does need to be tied to bringing down production of fossil fuels, but also making sure that the finance is there to actually ensure that the transition is made, that countries like mine, like the Marshall Islands, and other SIDS, small island developing states and least developed countries who currently cannot access and don't have the means to make this transition, that they're not left behind. Yeah. So all of that needs to be part of the package that we deliver at COP28 in Dubai.
Yeah.
In addition to that,
sorry, continue.
Well, in addition to that, I mean, there's a lot of focus on what needs to be done in terms of transitioning our energy systems. And I know that you're talking a lot about that today, but we cannot forget that for much of the developing world, and certainly for countries like the Marshall Islands, the finance that we need to secure our future through adaptation needs to be in place. It's at the heart of what we agreed to when we agreed to Paris. It's a lifeline. And when you don't have that, what you inevitably get is loss and damage, right? So we're already seeing it now. The fact that we see loss and damage today both reflects the lack of speed and scale to deliver on mitigation, but also the lack of speed and scale to deliver on adaptation. When those things don't happen, you're left with loss and damage. And countries like mine have no ability at all right now to respond to those losses and damages.
Yeah, there's some steps being taken in that direction, right? We're having this new fund being established, hopefully, at COP28, or that's the idea in any case, to support countries experiencing climate damages. And I'm wondering what you think about what scale that fund needs to have, what sort of level of investment is required in it. Because I'm asking because we've just had yesterday the EU Climate Commissioner Wopke Hoekstra say that the EU will make a substantial contribution to the fund at COP28. What does substantial look like to you? Like, what are we talking about?
Yeah, so first of all, I think we all need to understand where we're coming from as of a year ago on loss and damage. At COP27, at the beginning of COP27, there was really no agreement or path forward that we could agree that a loss and damage fund was necessary. And the Marshall Islands, and particularly other Small Island developing states that have been advocating for this for over 30 years, essentially what we saw happen for us was that, an impossibility was made possible when there was finally agreement in the last days of that COP in Sharm el-Sheikh that, yes, loss and damage has been a gaping hole in the response to climate change, and it needs to be addressed. So since then, there's been quite a bit of work by what we call the Transitional Committee. And just recently, in the last week, they came out with an agreement that, shows a way forward to make this fund a reality. So now what is needed is to actually give life to it. We can't afford to go to this COP and essentially have an empty shell of a fund. That would fly in the face of what the Paris Agreement, as I've said, stands for, which is this collective agreement that we have to respond together to this crisis, and that the most vulnerable need, in particular, support in that regard. So the announcements and Zia, your reporting actually on this, the substantial financial pledge that the EU will be making is really a boost, I think, and necessary for where we need to be, particularly at the start of COP, to be able to collectively work together with this idea that we do trust, that we are in fact working together, and that we're going to come out of it with a fund that is capitalized and can help the most vulnerable. I don't think it's possible at this stage to really put a number on how much what that needs to be, because even putting a number of how much loss and damage has already occurred, that's just not where we are. But what is important is that there is a substantial contribution that shows that there is solidarity, that there is understanding from our partners in the European Union that loss and damage has occurred, is occurred, and will occur, and that this is a mechanism, this fund is in fact a mechanism that will support countries like the Marshall Islands in responding to that loss and damage. And if we have that, then that helps unlock progress across the board, this progress that I was talking about earlier under the global stocktake, which is what we need. We need to be making progress in all areas, whether it's mitigation, adaptation. And by the way, I think the numbers I've seen is that it's, the finance gap for adaptation alone is about 200 plus billion per year until 2030. That's adaptation. So again, going back to your question on what the capitalization should be for loss and damage, we really need to look at the science, look at the numbers and see what that is. But it clearly, seeing the gaps in the other areas, clearly this pledge, any pledge to that fund should be substantial. That will help across the board, as I say, put momentum, put trust back into the process, that we're there to help each other and to move forward collectively.
Yeah. You earlier just mentioned the importance of phasing out fossil fuel production, and the High Ambition Coalition, which is, to just explain that very briefly, is an alliance of countries that has traditionally been supported also by the European Union, that has pushed for climate ambition at international talks. And they came out recently with a statement, right, that called for the phase out of, I think it was fossil fuel production and use. And I was surprised to see that the EU did not back that statement. Were you disappointed with that? I saw some individual EU countries signed it, but what does that mean to you, and what does that mean also going into COP28?
So just to give you a little history on the High Ambition Coalition, it really came together back in Paris in 2015. And many folks will remember in that those last moments, members of the High Ambition Coalition, which is chaired by the Marshall Islands, but just so many countries in support of each other, walking into the room in support of 1.5. And really, the 1.5 temperature limit, the fact that it's reflected in the Paris Agreement, was a goal at that time that honestly many thought was unrealistic, very much aspirational. And 5 years later, we see, over 5 years later now, going into this global stock take, that it's actually at the heart of what's needed to secure our future. That High Ambition Coalition, we've continued to work with the members. It's a place where countries can come together at a table, look across at each other, look each other in the eye, ministers look each other in the eye, and frankly say, where things are not working, and what ambition is needed to secure 1.5, to keep 1.5 alive. So we hope and pray that we will see others coming on to the call for the fossil fuel phase out that is needed. We have a very strong core group of countries from Europe who have joined us in that call. And we would love to see the Commission join us as well, as they have done on many other hack statements over the course of the past years. And I think that that is something we'll continue to work for at this COP. And just to underscore, we have a UNEP production gap report that shows that currently, with plans in place, governments look to produce double the amount of fossil fuels in 2030 that would be allowed for a 1.5 temperature limit. So we're very much not on track. We're not phasing out. We're not even phasing down. Production is going up. And we need to address that basic root of the climate crisis. We need to be able to speak to it, particularly in this process, the UNFCCC process, which is about responding to the climate crisis. So we look to working with all of the members of the High Ambition Coalition to really see that happen at this COP.
Okay, thanks so much, Tina. We're running out of time, but we've just got time for a closing statement or a last question, and that would be, what would constitute a successful COP28 for you, and when would you classify it as a failure?
This COP is, and I keep coming back to the global stocktake, that process, it's the tool in the Paris Agreement where we hold ourselves accountable and where we say and affirm that, we believe in Paris and that, by taking decisions that address the gaps, the really huge gaps that we see across the board on mitigation, on adaptation, loss and damage, and finance, we affirm that we hold ourselves accountable and we're going to seek solutions and a way forward to address those gaps. I can't emphasize enough, we have a chance to protect the integrity of the Paris Agreement, a chance to demonstrate that, in fact, multilateralism does work, that global crisis requires a global response, and we're in it together, and that we can deliver and we can collectively meet the moment and respond to the crisis that is climate change. So this is it's such a pivotal moment, and we look to particularly those who have the means, whether it's finance or technology, to really step up and show leadership and ensure that places like the Marshall Islands continue to have a future on this planet.
Tina, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
Right, thank you. And now please welcome back to the stage Jan Chensky, who's going to give a closing statement on the climate segment. And I'm going to go.
Thanks very much, Zia, and thanks for leading that panel. I think it was a really good way of sort of summing up the stakes of what's at play. I think what we really heard from this morning underlines the difficulty of reaching the Green Deal goals. Almost everybody that we had on stage does agree that the situation is dire, does agree that action needs to be taken. The problem comes when you start to look for specific solutions. How will farmers react? How can the EU balance between China and the US? How to deal with hard-to-abate sectors? Who will be the winners and the losers? All of that brings in politics. We had politicians here on stage from the left, the center, and the right, again, broadly agreeing that there is a climate crisis, but with deep disagreements on how to tackle that issue, how to distribute the costs and the consequences of those actions. And I think that the insight as well is that that this clash is likely to be exacerbated by the results of the next European election. I think we also got a pretty strong sense that the Green Deal and its associated policies have made enormous progress. There was probably a lot of skepticism when this commission came in that we would be this far along. But then the overarching goal of the whole policy, the reason that it's actually implemented, is to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And that's still slipping out of reach. If you glance at our website, there's a story that moved just a few minutes ago from our US colleagues, and it says that greenhouse gas emissions will rise by 9% by the end of this decade, and that's from the UN Climate Secretariat. And the real-world consequences of that, we heard from Tina, and how the Marshall Islands is just demanding that there be some sort of an action from the rest of the world to limit and mitigate the consequences of climate change. All food for thought as we break for lunch, which will be served in the main networking room. Obviously, this does not apply to our online audience, which will have to break for a bit before we come back. This afternoon, we're going to be looking at mobility sessions, again, overarching theme of sustainability and the transition to a much greener form of transport and mobility. We'll hear from the Belgian transport minister, and we'll cover topics including Euro 7, the non-CO2 emissions effort that's now going on, greening freight transport, e-fuels, and others. So please be back in your chairs by 2:10 p.m. Thank you.
This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.